Anaya Rathore's dream was to heal the world, but her final journey turned into a nightmare when she stepped onto a bus driven by Ravikesh Malhotra, with Nalin Verma, Jatin Bhasra and Samar Dutt waiting in the shadows. That night, what began as an ordinary ride through Delhi would spiral into one of the darkest crimes the world had ever witnessed. On a cold December evening in Delhi, the city seemed alive with the usual chaos of traffic, honking cars, and glowing streetlights that painted the night in orange hues. Among the thousands of people making their way home was Anaya Rathore, a 23-year-old medical student who carried dreams larger than her small neighborhood could hold. She had spent the evening at a movie theater with her close friend, enjoying a rare break from the relentless pressure of studies and hospital rotations. It was supposed to be a simple night out, filled with laughter, snacks, and the comfort of friendship. Nothing about the evening hinted at the tragedy that was waiting for her just beyond the theater doors. After stepping out of the cinema hall, Anaya and her friend looked for a way back home. Public buses were the usual option, cheap and frequent, but at that late hour, only a few still operated. They spotted one parked near the road, a white private bus that looked worn out with its chipped paint and faded seats, visible from the window. The signboard displayed a familiar route, and with no reason to suspect otherwise, they boarded. At first glance, it seemed like an ordinary bus, just another piece of Delhi's vast transport puzzle. But what they didn't know was that this particular vehicle was already a trap, waiting for unsuspecting passengers to step inside. Inside the bus, the air felt thick. The driver, Ravikesh Malhotra, a man in his 30s with sharp, unforgiving eyes, glanced at them through the rearview mirror. His expression held something unsettling, but it was masked well enough for the passengers not to notice. In the back, a few young men lounged casually, pretending to be ordinary commuters. Nalin Verma, a college dropout with a restless energy, whispered something to Jatin Bhasra, whose body language carried the confidence of someone used to trouble. Near them sat Samar Dutt, the youngest, trying hard to appear fearless in front of the others. Together, they had boarded the bus not to travel, but to hunt. As the vehicle started moving, Anaya sat by the window, holding her bag close, while her friend tried to relax. The night outside was quiet, and the streets began to empty as the bus left the more crowded parts of the city. The hum of the engine filled the silence, accompanied by the faint rattling of loose metal parts. To any outsider, this was nothing unusual, just another late-night ride in Delhi. But to Anaya, a subtle unease began to creep in. Something about the way the men shifted in their seats, the way the driver kept checking the mirror, and the emptiness of the road outside felt wrong. Still, she reminded herself that fear was often exaggerated in the imagination. She had always believed that the city, no matter how rough, could not swallow her whole. She was strong, independent, and determined to chase her goals. With exams ahead and a career to build, she pushed aside her uneasiness, telling herself she just needed to reach home safely. But in the back of the bus, the men were already exchanging silent signals, preparing for something darker than anyone could have imagined. The bus soon left the main highway and turned onto a quieter, dimly lit road. It was a subtle change, not enough to raise immediate alarm, but enough for Anaya to notice the unfamiliar surroundings. The driver's grip on the wheel tightened as if he was deliberately steering them into isolation. Ravikesh had driven this route before, many times, and he knew exactly where the streetlights ended and where the shadows stretched long and empty. Each turn was carefully chosen, each mile taking them further from the safety of the city's crowded heart. Anaya glanced at her friend, who shifted uneasily in his seat. Neither spoke, but both could sense the same tension in the air. The men at the back began to move, their casual demeanor slipping into something more sinister. Jatin leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, while Nalin tapped his foot impatiently. Samar kept looking between them, unsure whether to smile or remain serious, caught in the pull of peer pressure and fear. Their presence loomed heavier with every passing second, turning the bus into a confined cage. What Anaya did not realize was that her decision to step into that bus had already sealed her fate. Ravikesh and his group had been roaming the city for hours, searching for prey. They had not expected to find someone like her, a young woman full of life and courage, but when they did, their plan sharpened with cruel precision. Every mile now carried Anaya closer to a nightmare that would shock not only Delhi but the entire world. The bus continued its journey through the silent night, weaving into streets that seemed forgotten by the rest of the city. Outside, the world had gone quiet, shops closed, street vendors vanished, and pedestrians disappeared into the warmth of their homes. Inside, however, the air grew heavier, and the false sense of safety Anaya had tried to hold on to began to unravel piece by piece. She noticed how the bus was no longer stopping for passengers. Not a single soul waved it down, nor did the driver slow at any standstill. It was clear now that this vehicle was not part of the regular service. Her heartbeat quickened, and unease tightened around her chest. In the back, the men started shifting in their seats, as if rehearsing a performance only they knew. Nalin Verma cracked his knuckles, his restless energy spilling into every movement. He had spent years loitering in the alleys of Delhi, angry at the world for giving him nothing, and now, surrounded by his companions, he felt powerful. Jatin Bhasra's expression was colder, his eyes narrowed with the hunger of someone who had already crossed moral lines, and had no intention of turning back. Samar Dutt, though younger, carried a dangerous desperation. He wanted acceptance to prove that he belonged to the group, and in that misguided loyalty, he was prepared to follow any command. The silence broke when Ravikesh Malhotra, still at the wheel, glanced into the mirror with a smirk barely visible on his face. That subtle look was the signal. The others straightened, their casual act falling away. The bus jolted forward as Ravikesh accelerated, and the doors clamped shut like prison gates. Anaya's friend shifted uneasily, sensing the trap closing around them. The men moved closer, their footsteps heavy on the floor, echoing through the hollow metal shell of the bus. It started with taunts, mocking questions that carried no humor, only menace. The words were sharp, aimed to intimidate, to strip away the sense of control Anaya still clung to. Nalin's voice rose above the others, filled with aggression. Jatin joined in, his tone mocking, daring her to respond. Samar laughed nervously, trying to hide his uncertainty, but his laughter only deepened the cruelty of the moment. The entire bus, once a simple mode of travel, had transformed into a cage where fear was the only passenger allowed. Anaya tried to hold her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. Her mind raced for possibilities, screaming out the window, pulling the emergency lever, finding some way to escape, but each option collapsed under the reality that they were surrounded, locked in, and helpless against 6 men who had been waiting for this exact moment. Her friend stepped forward, trying to shield her, but the attackers had the advantage. They circled, feeding off each other's energy, the violence building like a storm about to break. The road outside grew darker, streetlights thinning until only patches of pale glow remained. Ravikesh deliberately steered them farther away, his hands gripping the wheel with calculated precision. He knew where the city was weakest, where the silence of the night swallowed all sound. The bus rumbled across uneven asphalt, cutting through deserted stretches where no one would see what was happening inside. The men began to show their true selves. Jatin pushed forward first, shoving Anaya's friend with brutal force. Nalin joined in, his movements frantic, like a man possessed. Samar hesitated only briefly before following suit, his fear overridden by the pressure to act. Every second turned more dangerous, and Anaya's resistance, though fierce, only fueled their cruelty. She refused to break easily, and that defiance became a challenge to them. The air inside the bus grew unbearable, thick with sweat, anger and violence. Each moment stretched painfully long, a twisted game in which the attackers held all the rules. The reality was brutal. This was no random burst of anger, no accident. It was a deliberate act, a crime shaped by choice, carried out by men who had abandoned their humanity. The attack went on relentlessly, as the bus thundered through Delhi's outskirts, its tires crushing gravel, its engine roaring into the night. From the outside, It looked like any other vehicle making its rounds, but within its walls, horror had unfolded in silence, hidden from the world. Anaya's strength, however, remained remarkable. She resisted, fought, and endured, refusing to let them see her surrender. In that moving prison, even while broken and outnumbered, she carried a courage that would later echo across the world. When the violence reached its brutal height, Ravikesh slowed the bus. They had gone far enough, and the others knew it. With their cruelty inflicted, they dragged Anaya and her friend toward the rear door. The night outside was cold, the road empty, and the city far away. The bus halted briefly on a desolate stretch of asphalt, its headlights cutting through the foggy darkness. The attackers opened the door and threw the two battered figures onto the street, as if discarding them like refuse. Without hesitation, the bus roared back to life and vanished into the blackness, leaving the victims broken, shivering, and alone. What they did not know was that the road, though deserted, would not remain empty for long. Somewhere in the distance, fate was already sending help their way, and the nightmare they had tried to bury in silence was about to ignite a fire that would consume them all. The night air was bitterly cold as Anaya and her friend lay crumpled on the roadside, their bodies battered, their breaths shallow. The headlights of the bus had already disappeared into the distance, leaving behind only the fading hum of the engine. Darkness surrounded them, broken only by the occasional flicker of a passing street lamp that barely touched the empty highway. The city that never seemed to sleep had abandoned this stretch, and silence hung like a cruel accomplice. For a few painful moments, it seemed as though no one would come. Their cries dissolved into the night, unheard, unanswered, almost as if the world had chosen to turn away. But fate does not always remain quiet. A truck driver making his way along the same road noticed two figures on the ground. At first he thought they were discarded sacks or stray animals lying along the curb, but as his headlights illuminated the scene, the horrifying reality struck. He slowed, pulling over a few meters away. When he stepped out, the sight that met him froze him in place. Two young people barely conscious, covered in blood, shivering in the cold. He rushed back to his vehicle and called for help, his voice trembling as he explained what he had found. The call was brief but desperate, and within minutes, emergency services were alerted. An ambulance was dispatched, its siren slicing through the night air. When it arrived, paramedics hurriedly lifted the broken bodies into the van. Every second counted, but the injuries were severe, worse than anything they had expected. Anaya, though slipping in and out of consciousness, still clung to life with astonishing determination. Her friend, equally beaten and terrified, tried to speak but his words stumbled, broken by pain and shock. The paramedics exchanged grim looks, realizing that both would need urgent care if they were to survive the night. The drive to the hospital felt endless. The city streets, usually clogged with traffic and noise, were empty at this hour. The ambulance sped through red lights, its wailing siren echoing against tall buildings. Inside, the paramedics worked frantically, checking pulses, administering oxygen, and trying to stabilize their patient. Anaya's body bore unspeakable wounds, yet she fought against the pull of unconsciousness, her eyes fluttering open just long enough to show the spark of someone unwilling to give in. Her friend, his head swathed in blood, managed to grip her hand weakly, a silent attempt to hold on to courage in the face of devastation. At the hospital, doctors rushed to take over. The emergency ward, stark and bright under fluorescent lights, became the battleground between life and death. Teams of specialists crowded around, their voices urgent, their movements quick and precise. The severity of the injuries shocked even seasoned surgeons, but they refused to stop trying. Outside the ward, nurses scrambled to gather supplies, while security struggled to manage the growing commotion. As word began to spread, news traveled faster than anyone could have imagined. A police team was dispatched to the hospital almost immediately after being alerted. Leading the initial inquiry was Arvind Kalan, a veteran officer known for his sharp instincts. When he saw Anaya and her friend on the hospital bed, he understood at once that this was not just another assault case. The brutality was deliberate, monstrous, and something the city would not be able to ignore. He quietly took notes, asking questions where he could, but he knew that the full story would only unfold later. For now, his priority was ensuring the attackers did not vanish into the night. Outside, the city began to stir. Within hours, whispers turned into headlines, and headlines grew into outrage. Journalists rushed to the hospital gates, cameras flashing, reporters demanding answers. Police officers tried to hold back the crowd, but the tension was already building. Ordinary citizens, hearing the news on radios and televisions, felt something inside them shift. It was not just another crime. It was something so cruel, so shocking, that it struck at the core of what it meant to feel safe in one's own city. Inside the hospital, Anaya's condition wavered between fragile stability and collapse. Machines beeped steadily, monitoring her vital signs, while doctors fought to repair the damage done. Her spirit, though trapped in a broken body, was strong enough to keep pulling her back from the edge. Her friend, though traumatized, provided crucial details to the police as soon as he was able to speak. He described the bus, the men, and the horrifying events of the night. Those fragmented words became the first threads in a net that would soon tighten around the perpetrator. What none of them realized was that this night had already planted the seed of something much larger than the crime itself. In those hospital corridors, grief, rage, and determination began to grow. A single act of cruelty was about to ignite an entire nation, and the world beyond would soon be forced to witness a story that no one could turn away from. By the next morning, Delhi was no longer the same city. What had begun as a horrific crime inside a moving bus now pulsed through every street, every marketplace, and every household. News channels broadcast the details relentlessly, showing the blurred faces of the victims, the frantic scenes outside the hospital, and the anger rising across neighborhoods. Social media erupted with outrage, spreading Anaya's story beyond borders in just a few hours. The city that usually thrived on its restless energy suddenly carried an undertone of grief and fury, and people who had never met Anaya began to see her as a daughter, a sister, and a friend whose suffering demanded justice. Arvind Kalan and his police team worked without pause. The description of the bus, provided by Anaya's injured friend, gave them their first lead. They combed through records of private bus operators, searching for one that matched the details. It did not take long to identify Ravikesh Malhotra as the driver. His name was already familiar to law enforcement, tied to minor offenses and a reputation for violent temper. Once his face was put into circulation, the hunt for his associates began. The first arrest came quickly. A police raid uncovered Jatin Bhasra hiding in a cramped apartment on the edge of the city. His arrest sparked fury in the crowd that had gathered outside the police station, with people chanting for the harshest punishment. Soon after, Nalin Verma was caught, dragged from a dingy tea shop where he had been trying to hide among the early morning customers. Samar Dutt was found wandering aimlessly, too inexperienced to cover his tracks, and too frightened to face the storm of consequences. Each arrest fueled the anger of the public even more, and with every captured suspect, the streets outside police stations swelled with protests and demands for justice. Candlelight vigils began appearing across Delhi. Students marched through university campuses, carrying placards with Anaya's name. Women filled the streets, chanting slogans that shook the ground beneath their feet. For once, the divisions of class and status blurred. Factory workers stood beside businessmen, housewives beside activists, teenagers beside elders. Everyone was united by the same cry, justice for Anaya. The government, caught off guard by the intensity of the reaction, scrambled to respond. Extra police units were deployed in anticipation of riots, while leaders issued statements promising reforms, but the words felt hollow against the growing fire of public rage. Meanwhile, inside the hospital, the atmosphere was heavy with uncertainty. Doctors continued their desperate fight to stabilize Anaya. She had undergone multiple surgeries, but her injuries were beyond anything they had treated before. The medical staff rotated in long shifts, some breaking down quietly in corners, unable to detach from the enormity of what they were witnessing. Outside the hospital gates, hundreds of people gathered each night with candles and prayers,
their voices rising together in solidarity. The crowd grew so large that roads had to be closed, and yet no one wanted to leave. The case soon reached international ears. Newspapers across the world carried headlines describing the brutality in stark, chilling detail. Foreign governments issued statements, human rights organizations condemned the act, and global activists demanded accountability. Delhi, once known for its vibrant culture, now carried the shameful label of a city unsafe for women. The pressure on authorities became immense, and the trial of the accused was fast-tracked, something rarely seen in the slow wheels of the justice system. Inside police interrogation rooms, the suspects revealed disturbing detail. Ravikesh showed no remorse, boasting of his actions as if they were a grim badge of pride. Nalin attempted to shift blame, insisting that he had only followed the other. Jatin remained cold, refusing to speak, while Samar broke down repeatedly, torn between fear of punishment and guilt over his role. Investigators pieced together their testimonies, the broken accounts forming a full picture of the night's cruelty. The evidence was overwhelming, and with mounting public pressure, there was no room for leniency. The city's protests intensified with each passing day. Demonstrators clashed with police outside government buildings, tear gas filled the air, and barricades were torn down by furious crowds. Unwilling to remain silent, Anaya's name became a rallying cry, painted on walls, shouted in unison, and written in the headlines of every newspaper. Politicians who once ignored issues of women's safety now found themselves pushed into action, promising new laws and stricter enforcement. Through it all, Anaya remained in her hospital bed, her body weak but her spirit still the center of the nation's fight. The vigils outside continued day and night, the flicker of candles reflecting the collective grief of millions. It was no longer just a case, it was a movement, one that demanded that no woman should ever endure what Anaya had faced. What began as a nightmare on a lonely bus had become the spark for a revolution that would not fade, even as the world held its breath for what would happen next. The trial began under the watch of an entire nation, a spectacle that carried the weight of millions of voices demanding justice. Courtrooms in Delhi had seen countless cases before, but nothing compared to the intensity surrounding this one. Security outside was doubled as crowds gathered daily, pressing against barricades chanting for punishment. Cameras lined the streets, reporters recited updates breathlessly, and every eye was fixed on the faces of the accused, as they were brought in, shackled and defiant. Ravikesh Malhotra walked in first, his expression hardened, showing no sign of regret. Behind him followed Nalin Verma, Jatin Bhasra, and Samar Dutt, each carrying different shades of fear and arrogance, but all of them bound by the same crime that had horrified the world. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with silence, as the charges were read. The brutality of the crime was laid out in clinical, haunting detail by the prosecutors, every word striking the air like a blade. Witnesses were called, including Anaya's friend, whose testimony was filled with pain, but also with determination to ensure the truth was never buried. His account of the night painted the room in stark horror, forcing even hardened officers to look away. Medical experts followed, describing the extent of Anaya's injuries, their voices shaking as they explained the irreparable damage inflicted upon her. The evidence left no room for doubt. This was a crime not of impulse but of merciless intent. The defense tried desperately to create cracks, suggesting drunkenness, poor judgment, even shifting blame from one man to another. But the collective weight of testimonies and forensic reports shattered those arguments before they could take root. Judges and lawyers alike knew that this was more than a case about 6 men. It was a trial about the kind of society people wanted to live in, about whether the system would finally stand with the victim, instead of hiding behind delay and excuses. As the trial progressed, the country's anger never dimmed. Crowds outside the courthouse swelled larger with each hearing, holding placards with Anaya's name, written in bold letters. Families who had lost their daughters to other crimes joined the protests, seeing in Anaya's case a chance for change, that their own tragedies had been denied. Candlelight vigils grew into massive demonstrations, with thousands filling city streets, braving cold nights to stand shoulder to shoulder in silence, or in fiery chants for justice. The fire that had started with one bus ride had become a national storm. Weeks turned into months, and the trial neared its end. On the final day, the courtroom was packed tighter than ever. Journalists pressed against one another, police officers standing rigid to control the chaos. The judge's words carried through the room with the weight of history as he pronounced the verdict. All 6 men were found guilty, their names forever tied to the crime that shocked humanity. The sentences were severe, reflecting not only the brutality of the act, but also the outcry of a nation that had demanded nothing less. The moment the words were spoken, the streets outside erupted. People cried, shouted, embraced, some falling to their knees in relief, others raising their fists in defiance against the cruelty that had brought them there. For Anaya's family, the verdict was both a moment of justice and a lifetime of loss. They had fought through unbearable pain, watching their daughter's story unfold on the world stage, knowing nothing could bring her back. Yet in their grief, they found strength in the belief that her struggle had not been in vain. Her name had become a symbol, one that crossed borders, languages and cultures. Around the globe, leaders spoke her name. International organizations used her story to call for reforms in their own country. Documentaries were made, books were written, and movements were born, all inspired by her courage. Laws in India were amended, introducing stricter penalties for crimes against women, and safety measures were pushed forward with new urgency. The trial of 6 men had transformed into a catalyst for change, altering the course of history in ways no one could have predicted. Yet beyond the laws and verdicts, Anaya's story lived on in the hearts of ordinary people. For young women walking home at night, she became a silent companion, a reminder that their voices mattered. For men who witnessed injustice, she became a reason to speak up rather than stay silent. For parents, she became a symbol of resilience, teaching them that the world their daughters deserved was one worth fighting for. Her life, though cut short, carried a force greater than her attackers could ever have imagined. The cruelty meant to silence her had instead given birth to a roar that spread across continents. In the years that followed, her name continued to light vigils, fuel protests, and inspire reform. She had entered that bus as a student, but she left this world as a symbol whose story would forever horrify the world, and forever reminded of the courage of one young woman who refused to surrender.